Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. The Ring Collector Arrives. The arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood in St. Mary Mead was accomplished with the sort of quiet efficiency that spoke of considerable experience in the matter of establishing oneself in a new place. Miss Jane Marple, observing from her cottage window as the removal van deposited its carefully wrapped contents before the premises that had so recently housed old Mr. Pemberton's tobacco shop, was struck by the methodical nature of the proceedings. "Most interesting," murmured Miss Marple to herself, adjusting her spectacles as she watched a particularly elegant woman of perhaps 55 years directing the placement of several glass display cases with an authority that suggested considerable familiarity with such arrangements. The woman possessed that indefinable quality which, in Miss Marple's considerable experience of human nature, often indicated either genuine breeding or a most accomplished simulation thereof. Mrs. Blackwood, as she had introduced herself to various neighbours during the preceding week, was a widow of refined appearance who had chosen St. Mary Mead as the location for her antique jewellery establishment. The shop, which she had christened Precious Memories, occupied the prime position on the High Street, and within a fortnight of her arrival its windows displayed an array of rings, brooches and necklaces that drew admiring glances from the village ladies. It was during her second week of residence that Miss Marple first encountered Mrs. Blackwood directly, having ventured into the shop under the pretext of inquiring about a small repair to her late mother's cameo brooch. The interior of Precious Memories was arranged with considerable taste, the lighting carefully positioned to showcase the jewellery to its greatest advantage, and Mrs. Blackwood herself proved to be a woman of considerable charm and apparent sensitivity. "How perfectly lovely," Mrs. Blackwood had murmured, examining the cameo with genuine appreciation. "Such pieces carry so much history, don't they? I always feel that jewellery holds something of the person who wore it, particularly pieces that were cherished." Her voice carried the cultured tones of someone who had received an excellent education, and her manner suggested both refinement and a deep understanding of human sentiment. Miss Marple had agreed politely, but something in the woman's manner had caught her attention. It was perhaps the way Mrs. Blackwood's eyes had lingered not on the cameo itself, but on Miss Marple's wedding ring, which she still wore despite Mr. Marple's death some years earlier. The glance had been brief, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple had noticed it nonetheless. "I specialise particularly in rings," Mrs. Blackwood had continued, her voice taking on a note of particular warmth. "Wedding rings, engagement rings, anything that speaks of love and commitment. There's something so poignant about them, don't you think? Each one tells a story of promises made and kept." During the following days, Miss Marple had occasion to observe Mrs. Blackwood's interactions with various village residents, and she could not help but notice that the woman's interest in rings appeared to be more than merely professional. When Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned her late husband's signet ring, Mrs. Blackwood's entire demeanour had sharpened with interest. Similarly, when young Mrs. Dane had admired a particularly fine engagement ring in the shop window, Mrs. Blackwood had questioned her extensively about her own engagement ring, its history, and its sentimental value. "She has a way of drawing people out," Miss Marple observed to her nephew Raymond during one of his visits. "Particularly the widowed ladies. They seem to find her most sympathetic." Indeed, Mrs. Blackwood had quickly established herself as something of a confidant to the village's bereaved women. She possessed an exceptional ability to listen with apparent deep understanding, and her own status as a widow seemed to provide her with particular credibility in matters of loss and grief. She spoke occasionally of her late husband, always with appropriate sadness, describing him as a man who had understood the true value of beautiful things and who had encouraged her interest in antique jewellery. He always said that rings were the most personal of ornaments, she had told Mrs. Weatherby over tea at the vicarage. They're worn every day, you see, becoming part of one's very self. When someone passes on, their ring carries something of their essence. And Miss Marple, who had been present at this particular gathering, had found herself studying Mrs. Blackwood's own hands as she spoke. The woman wore a plain gold band, naturally enough, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes had noticed something curious. On closer observation, which she accomplished with the skill of long practice, she realised that the ring appeared to be of a different style from day to day. Sometimes it was a simple band, sometimes it featured a small stone, and occasionally it seemed to have a slightly different gold tone altogether. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured to herself as she walked home that evening. In her experience, which was considerable, wedding rings were among the most constant of human possessions. A woman might change her earrings daily, might rotate through various brooches and necklaces, but her wedding ring remained unchanged, a permanent symbol of lasting commitment. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Blackwood's establishment thrived. The village ladies found her prices fair, her manner delightful, and her understanding of their sentimental attachments to their jewellery most comforting. She had a particular gift for making them feel that their treasures would be appreciated and valued, even if circumstances required them to part with certain pieces. "She's quite remarkable," Mrs. Bantry had commented to Miss Marple. "She seems to understand exactly how one feels about parting with something precious. Not like those horrid dealers in Much Benham, who make one feel like a fool for caring about such things." Miss Marple had nodded thoughtfully, but privately she continued to wonder about the woman who had arrived so suddenly in their midst. There was something in Mrs. Blackwood's manner when she handled rings that suggested an intensity of feeling that went beyond mere professional interest. Her eyes would brighten, her breathing would quicken slightly, and her fingers would trace the metal with an almost reverent touch. Rather like someone handling something they love, Miss Marple reflected, or perhaps something they covet. It was this observation that led Miss Marple to begin paying closer attention to Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood and her curious specialisation in the rings that symbolised other people's most cherished memories. Chapter 2. The First Suspicious Purchase. It was on a particularly grey Thursday morning in late October that Miss Marple first witnessed what she would later recognise as Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's technique in full operation. The target of Mrs. Blackwood's attention was Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, a woman of 73 who had been recently widowed after what the village unanimously agreed had been a marriage of exceptional devotion and happiness. Miss Marple had encountered Mrs. Patterson emerging from the post office, her face bearing the particular expression of bewildered distress that marked those still adjusting to the harsh reality of solitary existence. Mrs. Patterson's husband, Herbert, had passed away quite suddenly 3 months earlier, leaving his wife not only grief-stricken but also, as was whispered with appropriate discretion among the village ladies, in somewhat straitened circumstances. "The dear man was never practical about money," Mrs. Bantry had confided to Miss Marple. "All heart and no head for figures, if you understand me. Left poor Dorothy with precious little beyond the cottage and her memories." It was precisely at this vulnerable moment that Mrs. Blackwood appeared to encounter Mrs. Patterson, quite by chance outside the baker's shop. Miss Marple, who happened to be selecting a small loaf for her tea, observed the meeting through the shop window with the keen attention she habitually applied to human interactions of potential interest. Mrs. Blackwood's approach was masterful in its apparent casualness. She expressed surprise and delight at the encounter, inquired with appropriate solemnity about Mrs. Patterson's health and spirits, and somehow managed to convey both understanding and practical sympathy within the space of a few minutes' conversation. "My dear Mrs. Patterson," Miss Marple heard her say as she emerged from the baker's, "I do hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I've been thinking about our conversation last week. About dear Herbert's ring, you know." Mrs. Patterson's face immediately took on the expression of someone who wished to avoid a particular subject. "Oh, Mrs. Blackwood, I really couldn't. It's all I have left of him, you see. 42 years we were married, and that ring never left his finger." Of course, Mrs. Blackwood replied with immediate understanding. "How thoughtless of me to mention it. It's simply that when I see such beautiful pieces with real history and meaning, I become quite carried away. Professional hazard, I'm afraid." Miss Marple noted the artistry of this approach. Mrs. Blackwood had simultaneously withdrawn her suggestion, while reinforcing the ring's value and her own appreciation of its significance. It was, Miss Marple reflected, rather like watching a skilled angler manage a particularly cautious fish. The conversation continued for several minutes, during which Mrs. Blackwood managed to inquire, with delicate concern, about Mrs. Patterson's circumstances. She learned, through careful questioning presented as sympathetic interest, about the mounting medical bills from Herbert's final illness, the difficulties with the pension arrangements, and the general financial pressures that were causing Mrs. Patterson considerable anxiety. "These practical matters are so trying when one is grieving," Mrs. Blackwood observed with perfect understanding. "Herbert wouldn't want you to worry about such things, I'm sure. He'd want you to be comfortable and secure." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Patterson's face as these words took effect. The older woman's expression suggested that financial security was indeed a pressing concern, one that weighed heavily against her sentimental attachment to her husband's ring. Over the following days, Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Blackwood's encounters with Mrs. Patterson became more frequent and, apparently, more persuasive. The antique dealer displayed a remarkable understanding of the precise balance between emotional manipulation and financial temptation required to overcome Mrs. Patterson's resistance. During a chance meeting at the village shop, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Blackwood sharing what appeared to be intimate details of her own bereavement. "When my dear Charles passed," she was saying, her voice trembling with apparent emotion, "I thought I could never bear to part with anything of his. But then I realised that keeping his memory locked away in objects wasn't what he would have wanted. He'd want his things to bring joy to others, to continue making people happy." The story was beautifully crafted, Miss Marple observed, designed to reframe the sale of precious objects as an act of love rather than necessity. Mrs. Blackwood went on to describe how she'd found peace in knowing that her husband's possessions were treasured by people who understood their value, who would honour the love they represented. "It's not about the money, you understand," Mrs. Blackwood continued. "It's about ensuring that precious things find their way to people who will truly appreciate them. I always offer generous prices because I want the families to feel that their treasures are valued appropriately." The amount Mrs. Blackwood mentioned as her offer for Herbert's ring set caused Mrs. Patterson to gasp audibly. It was, Miss Marple calculated, approximately 3 times what such pieces might reasonably be expected to fetch at auction, and certainly enough to resolve Mrs. Patterson's immediate financial difficulties. "But I couldn't possibly accept so much," Mrs. Patterson protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "My dear woman," Mrs. Blackwood replied firmly, "beautiful things created with love deserve to be valued properly. That ring represents 42 years of devotion. How could one put an ordinary price on such a thing?" Miss Marple found herself both impressed and disturbed by the psychological sophistication of Mrs. Blackwood's approach. The woman had managed to transform what was essentially a commercial transaction into an act of romantic tribute, making it appear that she was honouring Herbert's memory rather than exploiting his widow's vulnerability. That evening, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Patterson walking slowly past the churchyard, her face bearing the expression of someone wrestling with a decision of considerable magnitude. The older woman seemed almost relieved to have someone to speak with about her dilemma. "I don't know what Herbert would think," she confided to Miss Marple. "The money would solve so many problems, and Mrs. Blackwood seems to understand what the rings mean. She says she'll treasure their romantic history." Miss Marple listened with appropriate sympathy, while noting the phrases that Mrs. Patterson repeated almost verbatim from her conversations with Mrs. Blackwood. The antique dealer had clearly been most thorough in her persuasion. "But it feels like selling my heart," Mrs. Patterson continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Those rings have been with us through everything. Our engagement, our wedding day, all our anniversaries. How can I let them go to a stranger?" "Mrs. Blackwood isn't quite a stranger now, is she?" Miss Marple observed gently. "She's taken considerable trouble to understand their importance to you." Mrs. Patterson nodded, though she still appeared deeply conflicted. "She's been so kind, so understanding. She told me about losing her own husband, about how difficult these decisions can be. She says the rings would become part of her collection of beautiful love stories." Miss Marple made appropriate sounds of sympathy, but privately she found herself wondering about this collection of love stories. In her experience, true love stories were rarely collected in the manner of objects for display. They lived in memory, in continuing relationships, in the way people chose to honour those they had lost. The following morning brought news that Mrs. Patterson had made her decision. She had agreed to sell Herbert's ring set to Mrs. Blackwood for the substantial sum offered, with the transaction to be completed that very afternoon. Chapter 3: The Desperate Widow. The transaction between Mrs. Dorothy Patterson and Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood was completed on the Friday afternoon, with all the solemnity of a religious ceremony. Miss Marple, who had occasion to pass by precious memories at the appointed hour, observed through the shop window as Mrs. Patterson handed over the small velvet box containing her husband's wedding ring and her own matching band, her hands trembling with what appeared to be a mixture of relief and profound regret. Mrs. Blackwood received the rings with an expression of reverent appreciation, examining each piece with the careful attention of a curator handling museum artifacts. She spoke in low, respectful tones about their beauty and the love they represented, while counting out the agreed sum with the precision of someone well versed in such delicate transactions. "It has been an honour to meet you, my dear," Mrs. Blackwood murmured as she pressed the substantial envelope of banknotes into Mrs. Patterson's hands. "These rings will be treasured always, and their romantic history will be preserved with the respect it deserves." Miss Marple noted the particular care with which Mrs. Blackwood handled the rings, the way her fingers lingered over the worn gold surfaces, and the expression of deep satisfaction that crossed her features as she secured them in her private safe behind the counter. There was something in the woman's demeanour that suggested these were not merely valuable acquisitions, but objects of profound personal significance. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the shop with the uncertain gait of someone who had just made an irrevocable decision of enormous consequence. She clutched the envelope containing her financial salvation, yet her face bore the stricken expression of someone who had just suffered a bereavement. Miss Marple approached her with the gentle concern of a neighbour who understood the magnitude of what had just transpired. "My dear Mrs. Patterson," she said softly, "how are you feeling?" The older woman's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I feel as though I've betrayed Herbert," she whispered, tears beginning to course down her cheeks. 42 years I wore that ring, and now it's gone to a stranger. What would he think of me, Miss Marple? What would he think?" Miss Marple offered what comfort she could, walking Mrs. Patterson home to her cottage and settling her with a cup of strong tea. The widow's distress was palpable, made all the more poignant by her simultaneous relief at having resolved her financial difficulties. She spoke repeatedly of Herbert, of their courtship, their wedding day, and the countless small moments that had made their marriage a testament to enduring love. "We were never apart for more than a day in all our years together," Mrs. Patterson confided. "When I looked at his ring, I could see our whole life reflected in that simple band of gold. How could I have let it go?" Miss Marple listened with the patience and understanding that had made her a repository for so many village confidences over the years. She observed that Mrs. Patterson's anguish appeared to be deepening rather than diminishing as the reality of her decision settled upon her consciousness. "Mrs. Blackwood seemed to understand the importance of the rings," Miss Marple ventured gently. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Patterson replied, her voice carrying a note of desperate hope. "She promised to treasure them, to honour their history. She said they would become part of her collection of beautiful love stories. Perhaps that's something, isn't it? Perhaps Herbert would understand that they've gone to someone who appreciates what they represent." Miss Marple made appropriate murmurs of agreement, though privately she found herself wondering what form this collection of love stories might take. In her considerable experience of human nature, she had observed that genuine appreciation of love's enduring qualities was rarely expressed through the accumulation of material objects. The following morning brought tragic news that sent ripples of shock and sorrow throughout St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson had been found dead in her cottage by Mrs. Hartwell, who had called round with some groceries and become concerned when repeated knocking produced no response. Dr. Haydock, summoned immediately, pronounced that death had occurred during the night, apparently from heart failure brought on by severe emotional distress. "Poor soul," Dr. Haydock confided to Miss Marple when she arrived to offer her assistance. "She had a weak heart, of course, but I hadn't expected anything quite so sudden. The shock of losing her husband, combined with the strain of adjusting to widowhood, must have been more than her system could bear." Miss Marple stood in Mrs. Patterson's neat sitting room, observing the envelope of banknotes that lay unopened on the mantelpiece beside a photograph of Herbert in his wedding suit. The juxtaposition was eloquent in its silent testimony to the conflict that had torn at the poor woman's heart during her final hours. "She never even spent the money," Mrs. Hartwell observed sadly. "It's all there, exactly as Mrs. Blackwood gave it to her. She must have been too upset to think about such practical matters." Inspector Slack arrived within the hour, conducted his examination with appropriate thoroughness, and pronounced himself satisfied that Mrs. Patterson's death was the result of natural causes. The weak heart condition was well documented, and the emotional trauma of recent bereavement provided adequate explanation for the fatal episode. "Sad business," Inspector Slack observed to Miss Marple as they stood outside the cottage. "These elderly widows often don't survive long after losing their husbands. The heart gives out from grief, you might say." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though something in the timing of Mrs. Patterson's death struck her as worthy of further consideration. The woman had seemed to be adjusting reasonably well to her bereavement until the transaction with Mrs. Blackwood had reopened the wound of her loss with such devastating effect. News of Mrs. Patterson's death reached Mrs. Blackwood within the hour, brought by the same network of village communication that had informed the rest of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple, who happened to be passing precious memories when the news arrived, observed Mrs. Blackwood's reaction with the careful attention she applied to all matters of potential significance. The antique dealer's response was everything that propriety demanded. She expressed appropriate shock and sorrow, spoke movingly of Mrs. Patterson's kindness and dignity, and offered immediate assistance with the funeral arrangements. Her concern appeared genuine, her grief properly felt, and her determination to honour the deceased woman's memory beyond reproach. "Such a tragic loss," Mrs. Blackwood murmured to the assembled neighbours who had gathered outside her shop. "She was such a dear soul, so devoted to Herbert's memory. I feel honoured to have known her, even briefly." Miss Marple noted, however, that amid the expressions of grief and offers of assistance, Mrs. Blackwood's primary concern appeared to be the security of the rings she had purchased. She spoke repeatedly of her determination to preserve them as a memorial to the Pattersons' enduring love, and she seemed particularly anxious to ensure that everyone understood her legitimate ownership of the pieces. "The rings are safe with me," she assured Mrs. Hartwell. "Dear Dorothy wanted them to be treasured, and I shall see that they are treated with the reverence they deserve. It's the least I can do to honour her memory." The funeral was held 3 days later, a simple but dignified ceremony that drew most of the village in tribute to a woman who'd been universally respected and liked. Mrs. Blackwood attended in appropriate mourning attire, her demeanour suitably grave, her participation in the service beyond criticism. Miss Marple observed her throughout the ceremony, noting the woman's facility with the rituals of grief and commemoration. Mrs. Blackwood appeared thoroughly comfortable with the forms and expressions of bereavement, as though she had considerable experience in such matters. Following the service, as the mourners gathered in the churchyard, Miss Marple found herself in conversation with Mrs. Blackwood about the tragedy of Mrs. Patterson's death. The antique dealer spoke with apparent sincerity about the fragility of the human heart, the difficulty of adjusting to loss, and the importance of ensuring that precious memories were preserved for future generations. "It's a comfort to know that the rings are safe," Mrs. Blackwood observed, her fingers unconsciously touching the wedding band she wore. "Such beautiful symbols of lasting love deserve to be treasured indefinitely." Miss Marple agreed politely, though she could not help but notice that Mrs. Blackwood's ring appeared different from the one she'd worn earlier in the week. The band seemed slightly wider, the gold perhaps a shade warmer in tone. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but Miss Marple's trained eye for such minutiae rarely failed to register variations in the familiar patterns of daily life. As the mourners dispersed, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious sequence of events that had led to Mrs. Patterson's death. While the medical evidence clearly supported natural causes, the timing struck her as remarkably coincidental. The poor woman had endured 3 months of widowhood with reasonable fortitude, only to succumb immediately after parting with her most precious mementos of married happiness. "Rather like someone who had lost her last anchor to life," Miss Marple murmured to herself, as she walked home through the gathering dusk. One wonders whether Mrs. Blackwood quite understood the full consequences of her persuasion. Chapter 4. Miss Marple's Curiosity. In the days following Mrs. Patterson's funeral, Miss Marple found herself possessed of that particular quality of restless attention, which invariably signalled the beginning of one of her periods of intensive observation. It was a state of mind that those who knew her well had learned to recognise and, in some cases, to regard with a certain degree of apprehension, for it generally preceded revelations of a rather uncomfortable nature. The focus of her scrutiny was naturally Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, whose behaviour in the aftermath of the tragedy had struck Miss Marple as worthy of detailed study. It was not that the woman had done anything overtly inappropriate. Indeed, her conduct had been exemplary in every respect that might be observed by the casual eye. Rather, it was the accumulation of small details, the sort of minutiae that lesser observers might dismiss as inconsequential, which had begun to form a pattern in Miss Marple's experienced mind. The matter of the wedding rings, for instance, had taken on a significance that extended far beyond their monetary value, or even their sentimental importance to the late Mrs. Patterson. Miss Marple had made it her business to observe Mrs. Blackwood's daily routine with the methodical patience that had served her so well in previous investigations of village mysteries, and what she discovered was both fascinating and somewhat disturbing. Mrs. Blackwood, it appeared, possessed an extensive collection of wedding rings, which she rotated with a casual regularity that most women might reserve for earrings or brooches. On Monday, she might wear a simple gold band. On Tuesday, a ring with a small diamond setting. On Wednesday, a band with an intricate engraved pattern. The variations were subtle, requiring close observation to detect, but they were undeniably present. "Most curious," Miss Marple murmured to herself as she sat in her garden, ostensibly engaged in the trimming of her roses, but actually maintaining a careful watch on the comings and goings at precious memories. One would think that a widow's wedding ring would possess a certain constancy. The behaviour reminded Miss Marple of her great-niece Dora, who had gone through a phase in her adolescence of collecting theatre programmes, not for any particular interest in the dramatic arts, but for the sheer pleasure of accumulation. There had been something compulsive about the collecting, something that spoke of a need that went deeper than mere appreciation of the objects themselves. Mrs. Blackwood's handling of rings in her shop displayed a similar intensity. Miss Marple had observed her through the window on several occasions, watching as the woman examined each piece with an almost ritualistic attention to detail. Her fingers would trace the circumference of each band. Her eyes would close momentarily as though she were experiencing some form of communion with the object, and her breathing would take on the measured quality of someone in a state of deep concentration. Rather like someone at prayer, Miss Marple reflected, or perhaps someone performing a private ceremony of considerable personal significance. This observation had led Miss Marple to pay closer attention to Mrs. Blackwood's interactions with the various widows of the village, and what she discovered was a pattern of behaviour that struck her as both systematic and somewhat predatory. Mrs. Blackwood possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of local marriages, deaths, and inheritances that could not have been acquired through casual social intercourse during her brief residence in St. Mary Mead. She knew, for instance, that Mrs. Weatherby's late husband had been particularly fond of signet rings, that Mrs. Henley's marriage had been celebrated with a rather elaborate ceremony involving heirloom jewellery, and that young Mrs. Dane's engagement ring had been chosen by her fiancé from a collection that had belonged to his grandmother. Such information required either extensive research or a network of informants that seemed improbable for a recent arrival to the village. "She asks a great many questions," Miss Marple observed to her faithful companion, Miss Knight, during one of their regular afternoon conversations. "Always very tactfully, you understand, and always with the most appropriate expressions of interest and sympathy, but questions nonetheless." Miss Knight, who possessed a tendency towards charitable interpretation of human behaviour, suggested that Mrs. Blackwood's curiosity might be attributed to a genuine interest in the history and provenance of the pieces she handled professionally. "Perhaps so," Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested considerable reservation. "Though I have noticed that her questions tend to focus rather particularly on financial circumstances and emotional vulnerabilities, she seems to possess an unusual ability to identify those aspects of a person's situation that might make them receptive to persuasion." The conversation had taken place during a period when Miss Marple's attention was particularly focused on Mrs. Blackwood's technique for establishing rapport with potential clients. The woman's approach was masterful in its subtlety, beginning with expressions of sympathy and understanding, progressing through shared confidences about loss and bereavement, and culminating in suggestions that seemed to emerge naturally from the conversation rather than being imposed from outside. Miss Marple had witnessed several such exchanges, and in each case she had been struck by Mrs. Blackwood's ability to make her targets feel that they were being offered not merely a commercial transaction, but a form of emotional support. The woman possessed an intuitive understanding of grief and its various manifestations, and she employed this knowledge with a skill that suggested considerable experience in such matters. "She has a remarkable facility for making people feel understood," Miss Marple observed to herself, as she watched Mrs. Blackwood console Mrs. Henley, who had recently begun to struggle with the practical aspects of managing her late husband's estate. Rather too remarkable, one might say, for someone who claims to have spent her career in the antique trade. This observation had prompted Miss Marple to make some discreet inquiries about Mrs. Blackwood's background and previous residences. The information she gathered, while limited, painted a picture of a woman who had moved frequently over the past several years, always establishing herself in small communities with significant populations of elderly residents, and always specialising in the acquisition of jewellery with particular sentimental value. "Most interesting," Miss Marple murmured as she reviewed the fragments of information she'd assembled. "One might almost say that she follows a pattern, though whether by design or coincidence remains to be determined." The pattern that emerged suggested a woman who had perfected a particular method of operation, targeting communities where she might establish herself quickly, identifying potential clients with both valuable possessions and emotional vulnerabilities, and departing after a relatively brief period with acquisitions that seemed to hold significance beyond their monetary worth. Miss Marple's investigation had been assisted by her correspondence with various acquaintances in other villages, women who shared her interest in local affairs and who possessed the sort of detailed knowledge of community life that proved invaluable in tracking the movements of someone like Mrs. Blackwood. Through these connections, she had learned of similar establishments in other locations, similar patterns of behaviour, and similar tragic coincidences involving the deaths of recently bereaved clients. 3 times in as many years, Miss Marple reflected as she reviewed the information she'd compiled, always elderly widows, always deaths attributed to natural causes, always occurring shortly after significant transactions involving jewellery of sentimental value. The coincidences were striking, though not necessarily conclusive. Elderly widows were, unfortunately, prone to heart failure, particularly during periods of emotional stress. The loss of treasured possessions might well trigger the sort of distress that could prove fatal to someone with an already weakened constitution. Nevertheless, Miss Marple found herself recalling her nephew Raymond's observation about the mathematical probability of such coincidences. Once is happenstance, he had said during a previous discussion of village mysteries, twice is coincidence, but 3 times suggests intention. The question that remained was whether Mrs. Blackwood's intentions were merely commercial, however callous they might appear, or whether they extended to something considerably more sinister. Miss Marple's investigation had revealed a woman who possessed unusual skill in the manipulation of grief and vulnerability, but it had not yet determined whether that skill was employed merely for financial gain, or for purposes that might prove to be rather more dangerous. Chapter 5. The Second Victim. The peculiar coincidences that had begun to occupy Miss Marple's thoughts with such persistence took on a rather more urgent character when, some 3 weeks after Mrs. Patterson's funeral, a second tragedy befell the community of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Gladys Henley, a woman of 71 years who had been widowed the previous spring, was discovered dead in her sitting room on a crisp November morning by her daily woman, Mrs. Jenkins. The circumstances bore a distressing similarity to those surrounding Mrs. Patterson's demise. Mrs. Henley had, only 4 days prior to her death, completed a transaction with Mrs. Blackwood involving the sale of her late husband's wedding ring, along with a matching eternity band that had been given to her on their silver wedding anniversary. The rings, which had represented 28 years of what all acknowledged to have been a particularly harmonious marriage, had been sold for what Mrs. Jenkins later described as a sum that fair took her breath away. Miss Marple, who had maintained her careful observation of Mrs. Blackwood's activities, had witnessed the gradual process by which Mrs. Henley's resistance to parting with her precious mementos had been systematically undermined. The technique employed had been identical in its essential elements to that which had proved so effective with Mrs. Patterson, though refined and adapted to suit Mrs. Henley's particular circumstances and temperament. Mrs. Henley had been a woman of somewhat different character from Mrs. Patterson, more practical in her approach to life's difficulties, less given to emotional displays, and possessed of what she herself had described as a sensible head for business. These qualities had required Mrs. Blackwood to adjust her strategy accordingly, emphasizing the financial wisdom of the transaction, while maintaining the emotional appeal that had proved so potent in her previous success. Such a practical woman, Mrs. Blackwood had observed to Miss Marple during one of their chance encounters in the village. She understands that sentiment, however beautiful, cannot pay the bills or secure one's future comfort. Dear Gerald would want her to be sensible about such matters. The reference to Mrs. Henley's late husband by his Christian name had struck Miss Marple as worthy of note, suggesting an intimacy of acquaintance that seemed inconsistent with Mrs. Blackwood's relatively recent arrival in the village. When she had made discreet inquiries, Miss Marple had discovered that Mrs. Blackwood possessed detailed knowledge not only of Gerald Henley's preferences in jewellery, but also of his habits, his profession, and the particular affection he had held for his wife. She knows more about Gerald Henley than some people who had been acquainted with him for decades, Miss Marple had confided to Dr. Haydock during one of their regular conversations about village affairs. One might almost think she had made a study of the man and his marriage. Dr. Haydock, when summoned to examine Mrs. Henley's remains, had pronounced himself deeply troubled by the pattern that was beginning to emerge. While the immediate cause of death appeared to be heart failure, Mrs. Henley had suffered from a cardiac condition for several years. The timing struck him as remarkably similar to Mrs. Patterson's case. 2 widows, both recently bereaved, both dying within days of parting with their most treasured possessions, he confided to Miss Marple as they stood in Mrs. Henley's cottage. It's enough to make one wonder whether grief can be quite as precisely timed as this appears to suggest. Miss Marple examined the sitting room with the careful attention she habitually applied to scenes of potential significance. Mrs. Henley had died in her chair by the fireplace, a cup of tea grown cold on the table beside her, and an envelope containing the substantial payment from Mrs. Blackwood lying unopened on the mantelpiece. The scene suggested a woman who had been overcome by distress before she could bring herself to handle the money that represented both her financial security and the price of her most cherished memories. She never even counted it, Mrs. Jenkins observed sadly. Poor soul must have been too upset to think about such things. She kept saying she felt like she'd betrayed Mr. Gerald's memory, selling off his ring like that. Inspector Slack, when he arrived to conduct his examination, displayed a degree of interest that had been notably absent during his investigation of Mrs. Patterson's death. The similarity between the two cases had not escaped his attention, though he remained firmly convinced that both deaths could be attributed to natural causes exacerbated by emotional distress. "Tragic coincidence," he pronounced after completing his preliminary examination. "These elderly ladies often don't survive long after losing their husbands. The shock of having to make difficult financial decisions just adds to the strain on already weakened hearts." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, though privately she found herself recalling her nephew Raymond's observation about the statistical improbability of such precisely timed coincidences. The mathematical odds of two recently bereaved widows dying within days of selling their wedding rings to the same dealer seemed to demand consideration of explanations beyond mere chance. Word of Mrs. Henley's death reached Mrs. Blackwood with the same promptness that had characterized the village's response to Mrs. Patterson's passing. Miss Marple, who happened to be in the vicinity of precious memories when the news arrived, observed Mrs. Blackwood's reaction with the particular attention she now habitually applied to the woman's behaviour during moments of crisis. The antique dealer's response followed the same pattern of appropriate shock and grief that had marked her reaction to the previous tragedy. She expressed profound sorrow at the loss, spoke movingly of Mrs. Henley's dignity and courage, and offered immediate assistance with funeral arrangements. Her concern appeared genuine, her distress properly felt, and her determination to honour the deceased woman's memory beyond reproach. "Such a dreadful loss," Mrs. Blackwood murmured to the gathered neighbours. "She was such a sensible, practical woman, so determined to make the best of her circumstances. I feel privileged to have known her, even so briefly." Miss Marple noted, however, that beneath the expressions of grief and offers of assistance, Mrs. Blackwood's primary concern once again appeared to centre upon the security of the rings she had purchased. She spoke repeatedly of her obligation to preserve them as a memorial to the Henleys' enduring love, and she seemed particularly anxious to ensure that everyone understood her legitimate ownership of the pieces. "The rings are safe in my care," she assured Mrs. Jenkins. "Dear Gladys wanted them to be treasured by someone who understood their significance, and I shall see that they receive the reverence they deserve." Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Blackwood's facility with the rituals and expressions of bereavement appeared to have increased since Mrs. Patterson's funeral. Her comfort with the forms of grief seemed that of someone who had considerable experience in such matters, and her ability to offer appropriate consolation suggested a familiarity with loss that went beyond her own claimed experience of widowhood. The funeral, held on a grey Thursday afternoon, drew an even larger attendance than Mrs. Patterson's service had commanded. Mrs. Henley had been a well-respected member of the community, active in parish affairs and known for her practical assistance to neighbours in times of difficulty. Mrs. Blackwood attended in mourning attire that struck Miss Marple as both appropriate and somehow too perfectly suited to the occasion. During the service, Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Blackwood's participation in the familiar rituals of grief and remembrance. The woman's responses were precisely timed, her expressions appropriately solemn, and her demeanour suitably grave. Yet there was something in her manner that suggested performance rather than genuine emotion, as though she were playing a role with which she had become thoroughly familiar through repeated practice. Following the service, as the mourners gathered to share memories of Mrs. Henley's life, Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Blackwood once again wore a wedding ring that appeared different from those she had observed on previous occasions. This one was slightly narrower than the band she had worn to Mrs. Patterson's funeral, with a subtle pattern that caught the light in a manner that seemed almost deliberately noticeable. "Such beautiful symbols of lasting devotion," Mrs. Blackwood observed when she noticed Miss Marple's glance. "Each ring tells its own story of love and commitment. I find them endlessly fascinating." Miss Marple agreed politely, though she could not escape the growing conviction that Mrs. Blackwood's fascination with wedding rings extended far beyond mere professional or aesthetic appreciation. There was something in the woman's manner when she spoke of marriage and devotion that suggested a deeper, more personal obsession with the symbols and ceremonies of romantic attachment. Chapter 6, The Ring Collection. The opportunity for which Miss Marple had been patiently waiting presented itself on a particularly dismal Tuesday afternoon in late November, when Mrs. Blackwood was observed departing from precious memories in the company of Colonel Weatherby, who had gallantly offered to escort her to Much Benham for the purpose of examining some estate jewellery that had recently come onto the market. Miss Marple, who had made it her business to be aware of such movements, seized upon this absence to satisfy a curiosity that had been growing steadily more urgent with each passing day. The means of entry to the premises above the shop presented no insurmountable difficulty to someone of Miss Marple's resourcefulness and determination, particularly when that someone possessed both a legitimate concern for the welfare of her neighbours and a skeleton key that had once belonged to her late father's collection of useful implements. The private quarters above Precious Memories revealed themselves to be furnished with the sort of tasteful restraint that spoke of considerable refinement, though Miss Marple noted that the personal touches were curiously impersonal, as though the occupant had assembled the appearance of domesticity without achieving its substance. It was the sitting-room, however, that commanded her immediate and complete attention, for it contained a sight that exceeded even her most pessimistic expectations. The walls were lined with glass display cases of the sort typically found in museums or private collections of considerable significance. Each case was illuminated with careful precision, and each contained row upon row of wedding rings, arranged with meticulous attention to detail. The collection was vast, encompassing hundreds of rings that represented decades of accumulation, and the care with which they had been preserved and displayed spoke of an obsession that transcended mere commercial interest. Miss Marple approached the nearest case with the reverent caution of someone entering a shrine, for there was something almost sacred about the precision with which the rings had been arranged. Each band occupied its own designated space, and each was accompanied by a small card bearing what appeared to be detailed information about its provenance and significance. The cards, which Miss Marple examined with growing fascination and horror, contained far more than simple descriptions of the ring's physical characteristics. They bore names, dates, and what could only be described as intimate biographical details about the original owners and their marriages. Here was documented not merely the acquisition of valuable objects, but the systematic cataloguing of other people's most private emotional experiences. Margaret and Harold Pemberton, read one card in Mrs. Blackwood's precise handwriting. Married June 15th, 1923. Ring purchased following Harold's death from pneumonia, December 1955. Margaret survived her husband by 6 weeks, died of heart failure while staying with daughter in Yorkshire. Miss Marple felt a chill of recognition as she read further entries, discovering reference after reference to widows who had died shortly after parting with their wedding rings. The pattern that had begun to emerge in St. Mary Mead was revealed to be merely the most recent iteration of a practice that had been refined and perfected over the course of many years. Dorothy and Herbert Patterson she read with particular interest. Married September 8th, 1918. Ring acquired November 2nd following Herbert's death from stroke, July 1961. Dorothy died November 3rd from heart failure attributed to grief and financial anxiety. The clinical precision with which these tragedies had been recorded struck Miss Marple as profoundly disturbing. There was something in the careful documentation of each woman's death that suggested not merely callous indifference, but active satisfaction in the outcome of each transaction. The collection was organised chronologically, and Miss Marple realised with growing alarm that it represented a career spanning more than 20 years. The earliest entries dated from the late 1930s, and the progression of locations revealed a systematic migration across England that had taken Mrs. Blackwood, or whatever her real name might be, through dozens of communities, each offering its quota of vulnerable widows and their treasured mementos. Gladys and Gerald Henley, read the most recent addition to the collection. Married April 3rd, 1934. Ring acquired November 8th, following Gerald's death from cancer, March 1961. Gladys died November 12th from heart failure, circumstances consistent with previous cases. The phrase circumstances consistent with previous cases struck Miss Marple as particularly significant, suggesting a level of calculation that went far beyond mere coincidence. The implication was that Mrs. Blackwood not only anticipated the deaths of her clients, but expected them to follow a predictable pattern. As Miss Marple continued her examination of the collection, she discovered that the rings were grouped not only by date, but by what appeared to be categories of particular significance to their collector. There were sections devoted to rings from marriages of exceptional length, rings from couples who had died within months of each other, and rings from marriages that had been celebrated with unusual ceremony or social prominence. The organisation suggested a mind that found deep satisfaction in the systematic categorisation of human emotion and loss. Each ring represented not merely a valuable acquisition, but a trophy commemorating the successful manipulation of grief and vulnerability. The collection was, Miss Marple realised, a monument to predatory exploitation, disguised as sympathetic understanding. Perhaps most disturbing of all was a separate case containing rings that bore no accompanying cards. These appeared to be wedding rings of more recent vintage, and Miss Marple suspected with growing horror that they might represent Mrs. Blackwood's own matrimonial adventures. The variety of styles and the careful preservation suggested that each had been worn for a significant period, and the absence of documentation implied secrets too dangerous to commit to writing. Good heavens, Miss Marple murmured to herself as the full scope of Mrs. Blackwood's activities became clear. The woman is not merely a dealer in other people's memories, she is a collector of the symbols of destroyed happiness. The sound of voices in the street below reminded Miss Marple that her opportunity for investigation was limited, and she began to withdraw from the apartment with the same careful discretion that had characterised her entry. Before departing, however, she took the precaution of noting several of the names and dates from the collection, information that might prove invaluable in establishing the pattern of Mrs. Blackwood's activities across multiple jurisdictions. As she made her way back to her own cottage, Miss Marple found herself grappling with the implications of what she had discovered. The ring collection represented evidence of systematic predation on a scale that exceeded anything she had previously encountered. Yet the careful documentation suggested a mind that believed itself to be engaged in something approaching scholarship rather than crime. She sees herself as a curator, Miss Marple reflected as she settled into her sitting room with a cup of strong tea. A collector of romantic history who preserves the symbols of love by destroying the lives of those who treasured them. The psychological profile that emerged from the evidence was that of someone who had developed an elaborate justification for her predatory behaviour, convincing herself that she was preserving something beautiful rather than destroying something precious. It was, Miss Marple realised, a form of madness that was all the more dangerous for its apparent rationality and systematic execution. Chapter 7. A Pattern Emerges. The revelations contained within Mrs. Blackwood's private collection had provided Miss Marple with the sort of concrete evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty. Yet she found herself faced with the delicate task of converting her discoveries into actionable intelligence without revealing the somewhat irregular means by which she had obtained them. It was a predicament that required both diplomatic finesse and strategic patience, qualities which Miss Marple had cultivated through years of navigating the complex social currents of village life. Her first step was to initiate a correspondence with several of her acquaintances in other parts of England. Women whose knowledge of local affairs and whose discretion in sensitive matters had proved invaluable during previous investigations of this nature. The information she sought was of a specific character, details about the deaths of elderly widows in various communities, particularly those which had occurred under circumstances that might be considered unusual or coincidental. The responses to her inquiries, which arrived over the course of the following week, painted a picture that exceeded even Miss Marple's pessimistic expectations. From Cornwall to Yorkshire, from the Welsh borders to the Norfolk coast, her correspondence reported instances of widows who had died shortly after selling precious jewellery to dealers who matched Mrs. Blackwood's description and methods. Mrs. Pemberton in Little Wickham had written with particular detail about a case that had occurred 2 years earlier. Most peculiar business, her letter stated in the precise handwriting that Miss Marple remembered from their school days together. Woman calling herself Mrs. Fairfax established an antique shop, specialised in rings and sentimental pieces. 3 elderly widows died within a month of selling to her, all from heart conditions that their doctor said were worsened by emotional distress. Mrs. Fairfax departed quite suddenly after the third death, claiming family obligations in Scotland. Similar accounts arrived from half a dozen other locations, each describing virtually identical circumstances and methods. The pattern that emerged revealed a systematic campaign of exploitation that had been conducted with remarkable consistency over a period of more than 2 decades. Mrs. Blackwood, operating under various assumed names, had perfected a technique that allowed her to extract maximum profit from the grief and vulnerability of her victims while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business practice. Miss Marple's analysis of the information revealed several disturbing consistencies beyond the basic method of operation. In each location, Mrs. Blackwood had appeared shortly after significant deaths in the community, suggesting that she maintained some form of intelligence network that allowed her to identify promising targets. Her knowledge of local families, their financial circumstances, and their emotional vulnerabilities had consistently exceeded what might be expected from casual social interaction. Rather like a predator that studies its prey, Miss Marple observed to herself as she reviewed the accumulated evidence. She appears to conduct thorough reconnaissance before beginning her operations in each new location. The geographical pattern of Mrs. Blackwood's activities suggested a deliberate strategy of movement that avoided detection by ensuring that sufficient time elapsed between operations in any given region. She had never returned to a location where she had previously operated, and she had maintained her various identities with sufficient skill to avoid creating obvious connections between her different incarnations. Most troubling of all was the escalating frequency of her operations. The early cases, dating from the late 1930s, showed intervals of several years between locations. More recent activities revealed increasingly rapid movements, with Mrs. Blackwood sometimes establishing herself in new communities within months of departing from previous ones. The pattern suggested either growing confidence in her methods or increasing desperation for the acquisitions that seemed to drive her compulsive behaviour. Armed with this intelligence, Miss Marple felt sufficiently confident to approach Inspector Slack with her concerns, though she was careful to present her information in a manner that did not reveal the full extent of her investigative activities. She began by expressing general unease about the coincidences surrounding the recent deaths in St. Mary Mead, then gradually introduced the additional information she had gathered through her correspondence. Inspector Slack's initial response was predictably dismissive. "Coincidences happen, Miss Marple," he stated with the weary patience of someone who had endured many such conversations. "Elderly widows are prone to heart failure, particularly during periods of emotional stress. The fact that 2 of them died after selling jewellery doesn't constitute evidence of criminal activity." Miss Marple nodded with appropriate deference, while carefully introducing additional details about Mrs. Blackwood's background and the suspicious pattern of similar deaths in other communities. She was particularly careful to emphasise the statistical improbability of such consistent coincidences across multiple locations and extended periods of time. "Remarkable series of tragic circumstances," she observed with studied mildness. "One might almost think there was some connection between Mrs. Blackwood's presence and these unfortunate events, though I'm sure there's a perfectly innocent explanation." The accumulation of evidence presented with Miss Marple's characteristic combination of persistence and apparent naivety eventually began to penetrate Inspector Slack's professional scepticism. The revelation that similar patterns had occurred in multiple locations over many years transformed what had appeared to be isolated coincidences into what could only be described as a systematic campaign. "You're suggesting this woman is some sort of professional confidence trickster?" Inspector Slack inquired with growing interest. "I'm suggesting nothing more than what the evidence appears to indicate," Miss Marple replied carefully, "though one cannot help but notice that Mrs. Blackwood seems to possess rather unusual skill in identifying vulnerable widows and persuading them to part with their most treasured possessions." Inspector Slack's investigation, once properly motivated, revealed additional disturbing details about Mrs. Blackwood's activities. Official inquiries to other police jurisdictions confirmed many of the incidents that Miss Marple's correspondence had described, and several forces expressed interest in interviewing Mrs. Blackwood about deaths that had occurred in their areas. The investigation also revealed that Mrs. Blackwood had been employing multiple identities with considerable sophistication, maintaining separate documentation and financial arrangements that allowed her to establish herself quickly in new locations while obscuring her previous activities. The skill with which she had managed these deceptions suggested professional-level expertise in identity manipulation. "Most interesting woman," Inspector Slack observed to Miss Marple as the scope of the investigation expanded. "Appears to have been operating under at least 6 different names over the past decade, each with complete documentation and plausible background stories. That level of organisation doesn't happen by accident." Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, though privately she suspected that Mrs. Blackwood's activities extended beyond mere financial fraud. The systematic nature of her ring collection, with its careful documentation of each victim's personal history and circumstances of death, suggested obsessions that transcended commercial motivation. The investigation's most significant breakthrough came when Inspector Slack's inquiries revealed that several of Mrs. Blackwood's previous identities had been associated with suspicious deaths of husbands as well as clients. Insurance investigators in 3 different counties had been attempting to locate a woman matching her description in connection with claims involving the deaths of recently married men, under circumstances that had raised professional concerns. "Beginning to look like our Mrs. Blackwood might be rather more dangerous than we initially suspected," Inspector Slack confided to Miss Marple. "If these insurance investigators are correct, she may have been using marriage as well as antique dealing to finance her activities." Miss Marple received this information with the grave attention it deserved, though she was not entirely surprised by the revelation. Her observation of Mrs. Blackwood's extensive collection of unmarked wedding rings had suggested additional secrets that the documented victims could not explain. The possibility that these rings represented Mrs. Blackwood's own matrimonial adventures provided a disturbing explanation for their careful preservation and prominent display. Chapter 8: The Bigamist's Trail. The investigation that had begun with Miss Marple's genteel observations about the curious inconsistencies in Mrs. Blackwood's wedding rings had, by the first week of December, expanded into what Inspector Slack was privately describing as one of the most complex cases of systematic fraud he had encountered in his considerable professional experience. The revelations that emerged from official inquiries across multiple counties painted a picture of criminal sophistication that exceeded even Miss Marple's pessimistic expectations. The breakthrough that transformed the investigation from one of suspicious coincidences to documented criminal conspiracy came through the persistent efforts of insurance investigators who had been tracking what they termed an unusual pattern of claims involving recently widowed women. Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell of the Imperial Assurance Company had been attempting for nearly 3 years to locate a woman who matched Mrs. Blackwood's description in connection with life insurance payouts that had raised considerable professional concern. "Most extraordinary case," Mr. Hartwell confided to Inspector Slack during a meeting that Miss Marple had been permitted to observe in her capacity as the primary witness to Mrs. Blackwood's recent activities. "We've identified at least 7 separate claims involving the deaths of recently married men, each involving a wife who disappeared shortly after receiving substantial payouts. The pattern suggests systematic bigamy combined with what can only be described as serial murder." The documentation that Mr. Hartwell had assembled revealed a criminal career that spanned more than 2 decades and encompassed activities far more sinister than the exploitation of grieving widows. Mrs. Blackwood, operating under a succession of carefully constructed identities, had been marrying elderly gentlemen of comfortable means, establishing herself as their devoted wife, and then presiding over their deaths, under circumstances that had initially appeared natural, but which, upon closer examination, suggested more deliberate intervention. "The method appears to be slow poisoning," Mr. Hartwell explained with the clinical precision of someone who had studied such matters extensively. Small doses of arsenic or similar substances, administered over periods of months, creating symptoms that mimic natural decline in elderly subjects. By the time the victim expires, the poisoning has typically progressed beyond the point where routine medical examination would detect it. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with a sort of horrified fascination that one might experience upon discovering that a neighbour had been harbouring a particularly dangerous wild animal. The systematic nature of Mrs. Blackwood's activities, the careful planning required to maintain multiple identities and simultaneous marriages, and the cold calculation involved in slowly murdering her husbands, suggested a mind of considerable intelligence applied to thoroughly evil purposes. 7 husbands, Inspector Slack observed, with the grim satisfaction of someone who had finally grasped the full scope of a complex investigation. 7 insurance payouts totaling more than £50,000. And that's only the cases we've been able to document through official records. The geographical pattern of Mrs. Blackwood's matrimonial adventures revealed the same systematic approach that had characterised her exploitation of widowed clients. She had moved methodically across England, establishing herself in communities where she could identify suitable targets, conducting brief but intensive courtships, and then settling into the patient work of gradually eliminating her husbands, while maintaining the appearance of devoted widowhood. The insurance claims were always filed with appropriate documentation and suitable delay, Mr. Hartwell continued. Mrs. Blackwood understood the importance of appearing grief-stricken while avoiding behaviour that might attract unwanted attention. She typically waited several months after each husband's death before departing for a new location. Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon the psychological complexity required to maintain such an elaborate deception over such an extended period. The woman who had charmed the village ladies of St. Mary Mead with her apparent understanding of grief and loss had been drawing upon genuine experience of bereavement, experience that she had created through systematic murder. Rather like an actress who has studied her role with exceptional thoroughness, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Slack. She understands grief so well because she has observed it closely in her victims' families, and she has practiced the performance of widowhood through repeated experience. The investigation also revealed the source of Mrs. Blackwood's encyclopedic knowledge of marriage customs, anniversary traditions, and the sentimental significance of wedding jewellery. Her collection of rings from murdered husbands had served not merely as trophies, but as research materials, allowing her to study the symbols and ceremonies of matrimonial devotion with the thoroughness of a scholar. Each marriage taught her something new about the psychology of romantic attachment, Miss Marple reflected, as she reviewed the evidence that had been assembled. She has been perfecting her understanding of love in order to exploit it more effectively. The revelation that transformed Mrs. Blackwood from a confidence trickster into a serial killer also explained several puzzling aspects of her behaviour that Miss Marple had observed during her residence in St. Mary Mead. The woman's particular interest in Colonel Weatherby, her careful questions about his financial circumstances and family connections, and her systematic cultivation of his trust now appeared in a far more sinister light. "She's been evaluating him as a potential husband," Inspector Slack concluded with considerable alarm. "All that interest in local marriages and wedding customs, she's been conducting reconnaissance for her next matrimonial adventure." Miss Marple nodded gravely, though privately she suspected that Mrs. Blackwood's interest in Colonel Weatherby represented more than mere financial opportunism. The woman's obsession with wedding rings and the symbols of romantic commitment suggested psychological motivations that transcended simple greed. She appeared to be driven by a compulsive need to possess and destroy the very thing she claimed to treasure most highly. "Rather like someone who collects butterflies by killing them," Miss Marple observed with characteristic precision. "She preserves the symbols of love by destroying the lives that created them." The evidence assembled by the insurance investigators also provided disturbing insights into Mrs. Blackwood's methods of victim selection. She had consistently targeted men who were recently widowed or divorced, individuals whose loneliness and desire for companionship made them particularly susceptible to her practiced charm. Her technique appeared to involve identifying such men through obituaries, social columns, and community gossip, then positioning herself to encounter them in circumstances that would appear coincidental. Remarkable predatory instincts, Mr. Hartwell observed with grudging professional admiration. She has an uncanny ability to identify emotional vulnerability and exploit it systematically. Each husband appears to have believed himself extraordinarily fortunate to have found such understanding and devoted companionship. Inspector Slack's investigation had also uncovered evidence suggesting that Mrs. Blackwood's activities were accelerating rather than diminishing. The intervals between her marriages had shortened considerably over the past 5 years, and the documentation suggested increasing confidence in her methods, combined with what might be interpreted as growing compulsion to repeat her crimes. "Beginning to look like she can't stop herself," Inspector Slack confided to Miss Marple. "Whatever drives her to do this appears to be getting stronger rather than weaker. Makes her considerably more dangerous than your average confidence trickster." Miss Marple found herself in complete agreement with this assessment, though she suspected that Mrs. Blackwood's escalating behaviour reflected not merely growing confidence, but increasing desperation to feed an obsession that could never be truly satisfied. The woman's collection of wedding rings represented an attempt to possess something that could not be captured in physical objects, the essence of love itself, and her repeated failures to achieve this impossible goal had driven her to ever more extreme measures. Chapter 9. The Insurance Investigator. The arrival in St. Mary Mead of Mr. James Morrison, private investigator, on a particularly bitter December morning, brought with it the sort of professional gravitas that transformed what had been a matter of village concern into an affair of national significance. Mr. Morrison's credentials, which he presented to Inspector Slack with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex criminal investigations, revealed him to be a specialist in insurance fraud who had been tracking Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's activities on behalf of no fewer than 6 major insurance companies. Miss Marple, who had been invited to participate in the preliminary discussions owing to her role as the primary witness to Mrs. Blackwood's recent activities, found herself studying Mr. Morrison with the careful attention she habitually applied to individuals whose presence might prove significant to her understanding of complex situations. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, possessed of the sort of quietly observant demeanour that suggested considerable experience in the assessment of human nature and the detection of deliberate deception. "I have been pursuing this particular individual for nearly 4 years, Mr. Morrison explained to the assembled group, which included Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple herself. She represents one of the most sophisticated cases of systematic fraud I have encountered in 25 years of professional investigation." The documentation that Mr. Morrison produced from his carefully organised files revealed the true scope of Mrs. Blackwood's criminal enterprise with a precision that both impressed and horrified his audience. He had assembled evidence connecting her to no fewer than 15 suspicious deaths across England, Scotland and Wales, each involving life insurance payouts that had subsequently been claimed by wives who had then disappeared without trace. "The pattern is remarkably consistent," Mr. Morrison continued, spreading photographs and documents across Inspector Slack's desk with methodical precision. "Target selection follows identical criteria: recently widowed or divorced men of comfortable means, typically between the ages of 60 and 75, with sufficient assets to justify the considerable effort required to establish matrimonial relationships." Miss Marple examined the photographs with the sort of careful attention she might have devoted to a particularly complex piece of needlework, noting the subtle variations in appearance that Mrs. Blackwood had employed to avoid recognition across her various identities. The woman's skill in altering her presentation through changes in hair colour, clothing style, and even apparent social class suggested considerable experience in the art of personal transformation. "Rather like an actress who has mastered multiple roles," Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. "Each identity appears to have been carefully crafted to appeal to the particular tastes and expectations of her intended victim." Mr. Morrison nodded approvingly at this observation, clearly recognising in Miss Marple a kindred spirit in the art of human observation. "Precisely so. She conducts extensive reconnaissance before approaching each target, learning their preferences, their social connections, and their emotional vulnerabilities. By the time she initiates contact, she has already become the perfect woman for their particular needs. The investigative techniques that Mr. Morrison described revealed Mrs. Blackwood to be a criminal of exceptional sophistication, employing methods that combined psychological manipulation with practical skills that bordered on the professional. She had maintained separate bank accounts under multiple identities, established convincing personal histories through forged documentation, and developed relationships with accomplices who provided references and social validation for her various personas. The poisoning method shows similar sophistication, Mr. Morrison explained with clinical detachment. Small doses of arsenic compounds, typically administered through food or beverages over periods of 6 to 18 months. The symptoms mimic natural age-related decline, and the progression is carefully managed to avoid arousing medical suspicion. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening with growing professional interest, inquired about the specific substances involved and the methods by which they might be detected in cases where suspicion had been aroused sufficiently to warrant detailed examination. Modern analytical techniques can identify arsenic poisoning even in cases where death occurred months earlier, Dr. Haydock observed. Have any of the previous cases been subjected to such examination? Mr. Morrison's response revealed one of the most disturbing aspects of Mrs. Blackwood's criminal success. In most cases, the deaths had been attributed to natural causes by attending physicians who had no reason to suspect poisoning, and burial had proceeded without the sort of detailed post-mortem examination that might have revealed evidence of deliberate harm. She selects victims with documented health conditions that provide plausible explanations for gradual decline, Mr. Morrison explained. Heart conditions, diabetes, respiratory ailments all provide convenient cover for symptoms that might otherwise raise suspicion. Miss Marple found herself reflecting upon Mrs. Blackwood's apparent interest in Colonel Weatherby, whose recent struggles with heart palpitations and elevated blood pressure had been the subject of considerable village discussion. The woman's solicitous inquiries about his health, which had seemed to demonstrate sympathetic concern, now appeared in a far more sinister light. She has been evaluating his medical condition as well as his financial circumstances, Miss Marple observed with growing alarm. Poor Colonel Weatherby's heart trouble would provide exactly the sort of convenient explanation she requires for her methods. Mr. Morrison's investigation had also revealed the source of Mrs. Blackwood's expertise in the emotional manipulation of grief and bereavement. Her systematic exploitation of widowed clients had served not merely as a source of income, but as a training ground for the more complex psychological skills required to establish and maintain matrimonial relationships with her intended victims. Each widow she encounters teaches her something new about the psychology of loss, Mr. Morrison explained. She studies their responses to various forms of pressure and persuasion, refining her techniques through repeated practice. By the time she approaches a potential husband, she has already mastered the precise emotional appeals that will prove most effective. The revelation that Mrs. Blackwood's collection of wedding rings included not only trophies from her murdered clients, but also rings from her own fraudulent marriages provided disturbing insights into the psychological motivations that drove her compulsive behaviour. Mr. Morrison's investigation suggested that she retained these rings as both mementos of successful crimes and symbols of the romantic attachments she had systematically destroyed. Rather like a collector who preserves specimens by killing them, Miss Marple observed with characteristic precision. She appears to believe that she is honouring love by possessing its symbols, even as she destroys the lives that created them. Mr. Morrison's evidence also revealed that Mrs. Blackwood's activities were becoming increasingly frequent and increasingly reckless. The careful intervals that had characterized her early crimes had given way to accelerated operations that suggested either growing confidence or mounting desperation to satisfy psychological needs that could never be truly fulfilled. The pattern suggests addiction rather than mere criminality, Mr. Morrison observed. She appears to be driven by compulsions that transcend rational self-interest. The risks she has been taking in recent years indicate someone who can no longer control her impulses. Inspector Slack, who'd been absorbing this information with the sort of methodical attention that marked his approach to complex criminal investigations, inquired about the coordination of efforts to apprehend Mrs. Blackwood before she could claim additional victims. "Time is clearly of the essence," Inspector Slack observed. "If she is indeed evaluating Colonel Weatherby as her next target, we must act before she can progress from reconnaissance to active courtship." Mr. Morrison's response revealed that arrangements were already in motion to coordinate the activities of multiple police jurisdictions in an effort to ensure that Mrs. Blackwood could not simply disappear to begin her operations elsewhere. The net that was closing around her represented the culmination of years of patient investigation and careful documentation of her systematic crimes. Chapter 10, The Final Confrontation. The moment that Miss Marple had anticipated with a mixture of professional satisfaction and human dread arrived on a grey December afternoon, when the various threads of investigation had been woven into a pattern so comprehensive that even Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's considerable skill in deception could no longer maintain the fiction of her innocence. The confrontation, which took place in the sitting room above Precious Memories, possessed all the theatrical quality that might be expected when a consummate actress found herself called upon to abandon a role she had been perfecting for more than 20 years. Miss Marple, accompanied by Inspector Slack and Mr. Morrison, had requested this final interview under the pretext of clarifying certain details about Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Henley's tragic deaths. Mrs. Blackwood had received them with the gracious composure that had characterised all her interactions with the village authorities, though Miss Marple's experienced eye detected subtle signs of tension beneath the carefully maintained facade of cooperative concern. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Blackwood murmured as she settled herself in the chair beside her carefully arranged display of antique jewellery. "I do hope I can provide some assistance in understanding these tragic coincidences. Poor Dorothy and dear Gladys. Their deaths have affected me most profoundly." Miss Marple observed that Mrs. Blackwood wore yet another wedding ring, this one a particularly elegant band with a subtle diamond setting that caught the light with deliberate prominence. The woman's fingers moved unconsciously to touch the ring as she spoke, a gesture that seemed both protective and proprietary. "We have been most impressed by your collection," Miss Marple began with the deceptive mildness that had so often preceded her most devastating revelations. "Such beautiful pieces, each with its own story of love and devotion, rather like a museum of romantic history, one might say." The compliment appeared to please Mrs. Blackwood, who smiled with genuine warmth as she began to describe her passion for preserving the symbols of enduring attachment. Her enthusiasm was unmistakable as she spoke of the importance of honouring the memories embedded in such precious objects, and her voice took on the reverent tone that Miss Marple had observed whenever the woman discussed her peculiar specialisation. "Each ring tells a story," Mrs. Blackwood explained with obvious satisfaction. "Stories of promises made and kept, of love that transcended the ordinary difficulties of life. I see myself as a curator of these beautiful narratives." Inspector Slack, following the strategy that had been agreed upon in advance, began to introduce specific details about the investigation that had been conducted into Mrs. Blackwood's background and previous activities. His approach was methodical and persistent, presenting each piece of evidence with the sort of measured precision that gradually closed the possibility of innocent explanation. "Most remarkable coincidences," Inspector Slack observed, as he described the pattern of deaths that had occurred in other communities where Mrs. Blackwood had established her business. "Rather extraordinary that similar tragic circumstances should follow your residence in so many different locations." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Blackwood's face carefully as the full scope of the investigation was revealed. The woman's composure remained largely intact, but subtle changes in her expression suggested a mind rapidly calculating the implications of each new revelation. Her fingers continued to touch her wedding ring with increasing frequency, and her breathing took on the measured quality of someone struggling to maintain emotional control. "I can hardly be held responsible for the frailties of the human heart," Mrs. Blackwood replied with studied dignity. Grief affects different people in different ways, and elderly widows are unfortunately prone to such tragic outcomes. Mr. Morrison's contribution to the confrontation involved the presentation of documentary evidence connecting Mrs. Blackwood to the systematic exploitation of life insurance policies through fraudulent marriages. His files contained photographs, financial records, and testimonials that painted an irrefutable picture of criminal activity spanning multiple decades and jurisdictions. 15 documented cases, Mr. Morrison stated with clinical precision. 15 men who died under suspicious circumstances shortly after marrying women who matched your description and methods. The statistical probability of such coincidences occurring naturally is essentially negligible. It was at this point that Mrs. Blackwood's carefully maintained facade began to show signs of strain. Her responses became more defensive, her explanations more elaborate, and her demeanour shifted from cooperative concern to barely concealed hostility. Miss Marple recognised the transformation as that of a skilled performer who had realised that her audience was no longer willing to accept the illusion she had been creating. "You have no right to make such accusations," Mrs. Blackwood declared with rising indignation. "I am a respectable businesswoman who has dedicated her life to preserving beautiful things. These tragic coincidences are precisely that. Coincidences that you are attempting to transform into something sinister through your suspicious minds." Miss Marple chose this moment to reveal her knowledge of the extensive ring collection that Mrs. Blackwood maintained in her private quarters, describing the careful documentation and the systematic organisation that had transformed what might have been mere business records into a comprehensive archive of criminal activity. "Such meticulous attention to detail," Miss Marple observed with deceptive admiration. "Each ring catalogued with the names and circumstances of its original owners, including the precise dates of their deaths. Rather more than simple business records, one might think." The revelation that her private sanctuary had been discovered struck Mrs. Blackwood with the force of a physical blow. Her composure finally cracked, revealing the calculating intelligence that had been concealed beneath years of practiced charm and apparent sensitivity. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of violation that suggested the collection represented something far more personal than mere criminal trophies. "Those rings are sacred. They represent love preserved for eternity, marriages that achieved perfect happiness because they were ended at the moment of greatest devotion." The psychological revelation contained in this outburst provided Miss Marple with the final piece of understanding she required to comprehend Mrs. Blackwood's motivations. The woman's obsession with wedding rings reflected not merely criminal acquisitiveness, but a twisted belief that she was performing a service by preserving perfect love through the elimination of those who possessed it. "You see yourself as a preserver of romance," Miss Marple stated with quiet certainty. "You believe that by ending marriages at their moment of greatest happiness, you ensure that love remains forever untainted by the disappointments and compromises that time inevitably brings." Mrs. Blackwood's response revealed the full extent of her psychological delusion. She spoke passionately about the degradation that time brought to even the most beautiful relationships, the way that daily routine and accumulated grievances transformed passionate devotion into mere habit and tolerance. In her distorted view, she'd been rescuing love from the corruption of longevity. "I preserve perfection," she declared with fervent conviction. "Every ring in my collection represents a marriage that ended while love was still pure, still beautiful, still worthy of eternal commemoration. I am a curator of the highest human emotions." Inspector Slack's formal arrest of Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood on charges of multiple murder, fraud, and conspiracy brought the confrontation to its inevitable conclusion. As she was led away, still clutching the wedding ring she'd been wearing, she maintained her conviction that her actions had been motivated by reverence rather than greed, by a desire to preserve beauty rather than to destroy it. Miss Marple, reflecting upon the case as she walked home through the gathering dusk, found herself contemplating the terrible irony of a woman who claimed to honour love while systematically destroying the lives of those who had achieved it. The collection of wedding rings, far from preserving the essence of romantic devotion, represented nothing more than the systematic theft of happiness from those who had earned it through years of mutual commitment and shared experience.